Hey everyone, Steve from Backcountry Gallery here, and this time around, I want to share 3 techniques I use to help create more depth and dimension in my wildlife photos. These tips will help your subject stand out from the rest of the scene and make your shots feel more three-dimensional. As a bonus, at the end of this video, I'll share a few of my favorite post-processing techniques that I use to help enhance the depth of an image back home on the computer. However, before we begin, I want to make it clear that not every scenario lends itself to showing a ton of depth. The techniques in this video will certainly help, but the scene itself has to work too. In the majority of cases, you can use one or more of the ideas in this video to enhance or create depth and dimension, but how effective those techniques are really depends on the scene at hand. Also, keep in mind that not every shot you capture requires a deep sense of depth to succeed. Often photos without it work just fine on their own. Not every single image needs to feel like the animal is sitting in the viewer's lap. The techniques in this video for adding more depth to an image are simply another tool that you can use when appropriate. Before we get into the tips though, I hope if you enjoy these videos, you'll consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. I really appreciate it, and it helps to keep these tips coming. Thanks in advance. Let's dive in. 1. Isolate with focus. The first trick, and probably my most used one, is to leverage shallow depth of field to isolate the subject from the rest of the image when I'm using a long lens. The reason this works so well is that our eyes are naturally attracted to areas of sharpness, contrast, and texture. So if your subject is the only thing sharp in the frame, it naturally tends to pop out a bit. In addition, we tend to perceive things that are out of focus behind our subject as being farther away, adding to that sense of depth. Unsurprisingly, one of the quickest paths towards this goal is a fast lens, like a 400 2.8 or a 600 f4. However, that's not the only path, and fast glass alone doesn't guarantee that everything you send to your memory cards will stagger your viewers with its depth and dimension. One of the keys to getting depth in an image is the distance between the subject and the background, and to a lesser extent the foreground if there is one present. Again, this is especially true of the background because if it's too close to the subject, even fast glass won't help. The thing is, when the subject is right against that background, there's generally not a lot of depth in the scene to begin with, so trying to show depth in an image like that is really tough. However, if you maneuver around for a more distant background, even a slower lens with like an f6.3 or f8 maximum aperture can produce a nice soft background, enhancing a photo's sense of depth. Faster glass simply allows you to get there sooner. Also, when I'm talking about out-of-focus backgrounds, I'm not strictly referring to like super buttery smooth backgrounds devoid of any detail. While those are a helpful ally in our quest for a dimensional look, you can still get a very good sense of depth even with backgrounds that give a nice notion of the habitat, and I usually prefer this. The key is keeping the harder, distinct edges away, since those are often what seem to rob the image of dimension. You don't necessarily have to kill the entire background to do that. In fact, smooth backgrounds taken to extremes, like a solitary subject against a blue or white sky, can sometimes feel a little flat. I think it's the differences in background brightness and texture that help create a feeling of depth, even the very subtle differences there. You can often still get these variances with a smooth buttery terrestrial background, but with a straight blue or white sky, it's more difficult because the subject takes on the appearance of being right on that background. It can also help to get to a distance where the animal fills the frame the way you want without cropping, as long as you can, safely do so, of course. When you're too far away, you're increasing depth of field due to the distance, and even if you crop the image for a tighter view back home on the computer, that doesn't change what you captured. In fact, even if the background behind your subject is relatively distant, if you're too far away, that background will still often show more detail than you really want. In short, it's so much easier to show depth and dimension if you're not cropping the hell out of your shots. Also, consider your height. Shooting from a low angle often causes the foreground and background to sort of pile up visually, and it gives you a much greater feel of separation as long as your background isn't, just plain sky. In fact, this is one trick I use all the time when shooting with lenses that don't have a super fast like f2.8 or f4 maximum aperture. 2. Light. We can also use varying brightness levels to help add depth and dimension to our images. This can come from foregrounds and backgrounds that are darker or lighter than our subject, or even from the way the light and shadows play across our subject and the environment itself. My most common approach to this is a subject that's a bit brighter than the background, but I'm also happy to go the other way with a background that's brighter than the subject. It all works. It's the difference in brightness levels that help create the depth. Also, note that I'm not saying you should look for pure white or pure black backgrounds. It usually doesn't take a monumental difference in brightness for it to feel like there's some added dimension and depth to an image. Also, the difference doesn't have to be strictly between the subject and the background. If the general area of the subject is brighter or darker than the rest of the shot, that can work as well. Another way to add a feeling of depth to an image is taking advantage of the direction of light when possible. Although a completely front-lit subject in the middle of the day is easy to shoot, neither it nor the other elements in the photo are going to show much depth or dimension. On the other hand, when the light is low and directional, that play of light and shadows across both your subject and the areas included in the shot can sometimes make it feel like you could actually walk right into the photo. Heck, even if the light is more or less at your back, but it's nice and low, it still generally creates a nice play of light and shadow, as shown here. In addition, and as long as the light isn't too harsh, leveraging side light, angular light, and backlight are additional tools you can use to help your subject really stand out. Side light adds texture and depth to your subject and the surrounding area, and that added detail, as well as the varying areas of light and shadow in the image, work together to create a sense of depth and dimension. Backlight is another powerful tool. Backlight will rim some or all of the edges of the subject, often picking up the fine hair or feathers at the edges of our animals. This has the effect of drawing a partial or complete outline around our subject that's a surefire way to make it pop right off the background. If side light or backlight aren't a good option for the scene unfolding in your viewfinder, most angular light can still add depth if the sun isn't too high. For example, in this leopard shot, the sun was, about 30 degrees off my right shoulder, and I think it worked well for spotlighting my subject and helping him to pop off the background a bit. The common denominator for using directional light as a tool to help add dimension to your images is shooting when the sun is low, like that golden hour after sunrise and before sunset. And ideally, not having the sun directly behind you. This not only provides depth and dimension to the habitat shown in the photo, it also tends to cause a play of light and shadows on the animal itself, creating even more depth. The problem with the sun higher in the sky is that it creates deep, dark shadows, and it forces you to shoot with it generally behind and well above you to avoid those shadows, and that's about as flat as it gets. 3. Colors. When it comes to creating dimension and depth in an image, I think color is often overlooked, which is too bad because it's a powerful tool. One tidbit I learned a long time ago was that warm colors tend to come forward in an image and cooler colors retreat. I leverage this little bit of information all the time. While shooting wildlife, this means I'm often looking for green backgrounds to put behind my warmer toned subject to help them really stand out. However, it works the other way too. A cooler toned subject against a warmer background, as we have here with his roller grabbing a termite. Like differences in brightness, differences in color temperature can add separation between our subject and the rest of the image, increasing perceived depth. We are also attracted to areas of saturation, and those areas tend to stand out more than the less saturated areas of the photo. However, my advice here isn't to get into an abusive relationship with your saturation slider, but rather just to raise awareness. If you have a brightly colored subject against a background or in a scene where nothing else shares high levels of saturation, it's going to pop really well. Finally, leveraging color often goes hand in hand with brightness levels and focus isolation. For example, in this photo, I positioned myself and used a cool but bright green out-of-focus background with a warm middle-tone bird, basically using multiple techniques simultaneously to really make him stand out. 4. Post-processing. As you've probably guessed as you were watching this, there are some things you can do in post-processing that can also help add a sense of depth and dimension to your images. We'll go over just a few of the most common ones that I use in Lightroom in just a moment, but I do want to emphasize that it's always better and easier to get it right in the camera than it is to try and fix it later. Plus, the closer it is to correct in the field, the less adjustment you'll need afterward, and the better your chances of your adjustments not looking out of place. First, remember that focus and contrast help our subject to stand out. While I don't advocate over-sharpening your images, you can adjust contrast, texture, and clarity. The trick is to do local and not global adjustments. For example, in Lightroom, you can use the masking tools to target just the subject and then apply your clarity and texture adjustments. If you want to keep it to just the face of your subject, you can just use the brush tool. Also, don't overdo it. This is one of those tools that sees a lot of abuse and can make your images look very overcooked. However, done with care, some added texture and clarity can really make a subject stand out. Now, to further enhance the look of separation between our subject and our background, we can actually take some of the texture and clarity out of the background. So we're adding it to our subject, but we're taking some of the texture and clarity out of the background, and that will further enhance it. And basically, it's just the opposite procedure. What we're going to do is we're going to go up to where it says Create Mask, give that a click, and we're going to select Background in this case. And that's going to select everything you see here in red. That's basically the background. It missed a little bit here, but I'm not too worried about that. If you wanted to touch that up with a brush, you could go into the Add button and use the brush to brush that back in. We're not real worried about that for this. I'm just trying to give you a quick demo. So what I'm going to do is go down to Texture and Clarity, but this time I'm going to drop them. So I'm going to bring Texture down, and I'm going to bring Clarity down a little bit. And if you notice, that background is now much, much softer than it was before. So let's take a look before and after here. See how soft it is there, and then how the harder lines kind of come back to it. So this kind of helps the subject to really stand out from that background too. So we have a pair of tools that we can use kind of in concert there to really make the subject stand out. However, one thing with this method is sometimes it can make the subject kind of stand out too much, and it can start to take on a cutout look. And obviously we don't want that. We want it to remain realistic. So another approach to this is just kind of softening the areas around the subject gradually as the eye falls away from the subject. And we do that with a radial gradient. So I'm going to delete this mask, and I'm going to create a new mask, but this time I'm going to do a radial gradient. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the radial gradient out here, and then I'm going to invert it so that it affects these areas. But first we need to create our gradient around the area that we don't want affected. So everything you see in red here is being affected currently, but when we invert it, it's going to affect the opposite area. So when I click invert, you can see that it affects those opposite areas. So what I want to do is I'm going to bring it like this. I'm going to pull this one out a little bit. Not going to go crazy here, just kind of giving you an example. So let's invert that and you'll see what I'm talking about. Anything that's red is going to be affected by our changes. So the central area, not at all. This other area out here, a little bit, and the area on the outside of the circle is going to have the full effect of whatever adjustments we make. Now, if you notice, the bird does have a little bit of red in here, so that means his wings are going to soften, his tail is going to soften. I'm going to show you how to fix that in just a moment. So first, let's go ahead and drop the texture and clarity once more. And this time, if you notice, it's really only affecting the edges. So it still gives you a little bit of extra depth. It still makes the picture look a little more dimensional, but it's not quite as harsh as the previous method. Now, as promised, if I show the overlay, remember, the bird is being affected here. So if you look at the before and after, you can see the edges are soft, but if you watch his wing, you'll notice the wing softens up a little bit too. All we have to do is click this, go to Subtract, and select Subject, and watch what happens when I click this. Just keep an eye on his wing there. See, it pops right back in. So, and if we look at our overlay, we can see that the subject has been taken out. So the subject is completely clear, our bird is completely clear, all of our adjustments remain in effect, and the outside edges are getting softened. If there's too much detail in the background, you can also defocus it a bit in Photoshop to help knock off some of those harder edges. This technique requires more time than we have for this video, but I do have a video that covers it. I'll put a link in the card above and in the description area below this video so you can see how to do it. Of course, when it comes to post-processing, there's more tools in the toolbox than just texture and clarity manipulation. We can also adjust brightness and color. Those are the other two primary things I use when I want to make my subject really kind of pop off from the background and feel a little more dimensional. So I'm going to show you how both of those work here. So in this case, I think a darker background would make him pop out much better than the background that's kind of the same brightness, maybe just a little bit darker than he is right now. So let's start with that. I'm going to go over to Create New Mask, and I'm just going to select the background. And this is really easy. All I'm going to do is just drop the exposure, probably by about a half a stop or so. So let's go, I went too far. Somewhere in there. And if you notice, he is really standing out from the background much better than he was before when we had the brighter version of it. So let's take a look at the before and after. So here's before, and just pay attention to how well he's popping off the background. That's the only thing we're looking at. And then I'm going to go like this. And if you notice, he definitely is popping off the background a little bit better when it's a little bit darker. However, that's not the only tool that we have here. Since I already had the background selected, I'm going to go ahead and add another adjustment to this mask. And in this case, I'm going to cool it off a little bit. The greens here aren't bad, but I think they could be a little greener, a little bit cooler, because remember what we said earlier, cool colors recede and warm ones come forward. And this is a good opportunity because we have these greens in the back and we have these warm colors in the front. So let's enhance that a little bit. The way I'm going to do that is I'm just going to drop the greens down a little bit. Now, you don't want to go crazy here. Obviously, he's really popping off of this background when I do that, but you don't want to go crazy here. You want to keep it realistic. So I'm thinking somewhere in here is probably pretty darn close, and it's pretty much what I remember. The greens were pretty bright down there in Florida when I got this photo, but that's all you have to do. Now let's take a look at before and after. Here's before, and again, just paying attention to how well he pops off the background, and here's after. It makes a huge difference when you just do these simple little adjustments. Oh, and also keep in mind that this doesn't apply every time, and that sometimes instead of darker, you'll go brighter in the background. Sometimes instead of cooler, you'll go warmer. Sometimes you won't do any of it at all. It just depends on the shot. So let the shot dictate your post-processing strategy. Of course, in some cases, you might find that Lightroom has a hard time selecting the subject, or you might find that the hard edges of the mask are too much of an effect and you want a gentler approach. And once again, like we did with texture and clarity, we can use an inverted radial gradient for that. So let's take a look at that with this shot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shut this off. So we're basically back to where we were. I'm going to create a new mask, but this time I'm going to use the radial gradient. And I'm going to go over here and just draw my gradient. Once again, remembering I'm going to invert this gradient. So this is the area that's not going to be affected, the stuff you see in red right now. And make this just a little bit bigger, bring that out just a little bit. And then invert. There we go. And I'm going to just drop exposure. And I can come in here if I don't like what I'm seeing and kind of mess with this a little bit. I think I have too much of an exposure drop. It's too noticeable there. We want to make it so that it doesn't look like we manipulated the photo. So that looks pretty good. And once again, we can go before and after, and you can see that it does help him stand out a little bit, even though it's not a hard selection on the bird itself. I still think he is popping off that background a little bit better. And as before, we can add other adjustments to this. So if I want to add some green to it, I can drop my tint here a little bit, right about here, and get some green in that background. That might be a little much. In that ballpark there, looks pretty good. So I can cool off those other areas. Now the area right here and directly behind him is not affected, but it still is making him stand out. And just take a look at the before and after, and I think he is still standing out from that background better than he was before we did the adjustments. Once again, keep in mind though that the adjustments you use and how you use them is going to vary by photo, and this is just a very brief tutorial just to get you started. This isn't meant to be like a full Lightroom course on how to make your subject stand out, but I wanted to give you the methods that I use most of the time. We do have one more though, so let's talk about that. Finally, we have to watch our color balance. As raw shooters, many of us set this after the fact. However, I notice people often try to push the warmth a bit too much, trying to simulate the nice orange glow of sunset light. However, that usually has the nasty side effect of introducing a color cast to the photo. The problem with color casts, even those beautiful warm ones, is that they sabotage the separation of colors in the photo. Instead of having distinct blues, greens, browns, etc., you have what amounts to varying shades of yellow, especially if you really crank the slider over. When you diminish the separation of color in an image, you instantly take away some of the depth. Although I know there are times you want a warmer look for an image, you should always weigh that desire against what it's doing to depth and dimension. It's a balancing act. I can't tell you the number of times I've had too warm of a white balance, and as I adjusted it, I could actually see more depth coming into the image the more I move my slider. The bottom line with post-processing is basically trying not to let everything stay uniform across the image. From color to contrast to brightness to white balance, it's the differences that help create depth and dimension in an image. Final thoughts. Once again, I want to emphasize that the techniques here are simply tools that you can put into your mental camera bag and pull out when appropriate. You don't have to utilize each technique every time you're out to have images that have a sense of depth to them. Mix and match and use what you can, because often just one or two techniques are more than enough to give your images more of that 3D pop we're all after. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out my educational materials as well. I have a variety of books and video workshops overflowing with field-tested advice that will help any photographer get better results the very next time they're out. Check them out. I just know you're going to love them. As always, I hope you'll stop by my site and sign up for my free email newsletter so you never miss one of these videos, one of my articles, or workshop opportunities, or any of the other cool stuff I do. And I do hope that you'll hit that like button, subscribe, and get notified. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.